Hi Maker, I'm Angel with FleeceFun.com, and today I'm going to show you how to make a satin trimmed blanket or a satin bound blanket. It is one of those wonderful classics that are great for baby blankets, but also nice for adults as well because it's a fun mix of textures. I'm going to show you how to do it, including those hard mitered corners. Let's get started. Here are the things that you'll want. For this project, you will need fleece or coral fleece. You can find the amounts on FleeceFun.com, depending if you want to make an adult throw, child, or baby blanket. 1 to 2 package of satin blanket binding, 1 for baby, 2 for child and adult. A rotary cutter, ruler, and mat. That's optional if you need to trim your blanket. A lint roller, a must if you're using coral fleece. Thread that matches the binding color, sewing essentials, and a walking foot. That's optional. I didn't use one, but it is nice to have. Or an edging foot, but again, you can do it without it. It's just one of those things that makes life a little easier. Now, I've mentioned this thing. I've mentioned it multiple times, especially if you're using coral fleece or double-sided fleece that has a little bit more of a pile to it. It's a little more furry. You're gonna want this guy because even taking it out of the bag that from the fabric store, it's going to shed. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna want one of these to save yourself, save your house, maybe run it along the edges of that cut of fabric. Also, you can take it outside and give it a good shake before you get started. It will just save you a lot of mess and a lot of stress. So there's my tip for you. How to make a fleece blanket with satin binding or trim. Instructions. Step 1, prep the fleece for sewing a blanket. Now, because of the fleece that I'm using, it is the same texture all the way to the edge of the blanket. So why give up more blanket space than you have to? Don't bother trimming off the selvages. It won't matter because they're going to be hidden underneath this thing. But if it is a regular fleece, or if it definitely has that binding, like if it's a minky or something like that, you will need to trim off the selvages before you begin. If you are making a baby blanket, you will need to cut it down to size. If on your fabric, like mine, the fluffy goodness goes right to the edge, there's no need to trim off the selvages. The fat binding will cover it up and you will get more of your blanket. So if the fabric changes texture at the edges, you'll need to cut off the selvages. Make sure that all the edges are straight. I also recommend taking the fabric outside and giving it a good shake to get all that excess fluff off the fabric before getting started. Now, if you're making a larger blanket, you will definitely need to extend that satin binding. I'm going to show you how. Step 2, make the satin binding long enough for the fleece blanket. If you are making anything larger than a baby blanket, you will need to make sure that the binding is long enough to go all the way around. You will need to sew 2 of the lengths of binding together. To make this as seamless as possible, the binding is sewn together on an angle. Take both pieces of the binding and unfold them. With right side slippery sides together, sew along at a 45-degree angle across the 2 pieces. I recommend drawing a line on the binding using a ruler to follow while sewing. So the reason we put 2 bindings together this way is that it makes it a little more invisible. Snip the excess, leaving about 1/4 inch. The blanket I'm working with is just 1 layer. However, you can do this with a 2-layered blanket. You can do, fleece back to back. But if this is your first time working with satin binding, I strongly recommend just doing it with a single layer first, and then you work your way up to the double layer. Step 3, sew the satin binding to the fleece blanket. Keep in mind, where you start adding the satin binding is where you're going to end with the satin binding. And in order to finish it off nicely, you need to give yourself a little playroom. So you're not going to just start at the very end and start sewing with the binding. You're going to leave some space with that binding so we have room to work with it, and then start. Starting 1/4 of the way from the edge of one side of the blanket, begin to set up the satin binding. Have the binding pinch or wrap around the side of the fleece. Make sure the edge of the blanket is to the crease of the satin binding. Leave about 4 inches at the beginning unsewn. This will help with finishing the blanket later. Using a wide zigzag stitch, sew along the edge of the binding to the edge of the blanket. This is to prevent the slippery satin binding from getting untucked at the corners. Finish the seam. Sometimes satin bindings are smart and they have just a little bit of a lip And so one side is just a titch longer than the other. Unfortunately, with this brand that I am using, it doesn't have that. So it is exactly the same width, which means, you just have to make the stitch a little bit wider to make sure that you catch everything underneath. Something that can help is a walking foot. If you have one, I recommend using it. I opted not to use mine in this tutorial as I figured most beginning sewists won't have one. Step 4. How to make a mitered corner on the satin bound fleece blanket. Once you have sewn to the edge of the fleece blanket, take the binding and turn it, and line it up with the next side, placing the fabric at the crease of the satin binding. The binding will naturally form a 45-degree angle where it turns to line up with the other side. Take the folded corner and edge of the binding and fold it around to the new side. You might need to manipulate the satin binding a bit to fold it properly, since it can easily slip out of place. Make sure that the fold makes a right angle at the corner and looks tidy. Double check the back to make sure that it also has a 90-degree angle and looks tidy. I recommend using pins sparingly in satin binding, but on the corners it's a good idea to pin into place to prevent sliding. Alright, so when we come to the corner, because we're sewing all the way to the end, it's not going to get untucked. And as long as you sew it from the edge down, it won't get untucked. Now, if you don't sew it all the way to the edge, these can get pulled out, especially by toddlers and babies. So another method, if you want to, you can just sew down this edge to tack it down, or you use a couple of hand stitches and tack this down to make sure that it doesn't go anywhere. But because we're sewing all the way to the edge, that shouldn't happen. Continue to sew the blanket, repeating this process at each corner. Now, one thing as you're sewing along, don't expect this to be perfectly flat and perfectly smooth. One thing is that you're dealing with satin, which has no give, versus fleece, which actually does have a little more give to it. So it's going to be just a little bit wrinkled in places. It's okay, it adds to the character of the blanket. Step 5, finish the satin bound blanket. All right, now that you've sewn all the way around and come back to where you started, it's time to finish off the blanket. Now there is a fancy way, which is kind of more advanced. I didn't do it that way. Or there's the easier way, that's the way I did it, to finish off the edge of the blanket. Once you come about 4 inches to the point where you began sewing on the binding, you have a couple of options on how you can finish the blanket, the hard version. Cut off the excess binding, leaving enough to allow the 2 ends to be joined, similar to how we joined the 2 binding strips earlier. Place right sides together. Then sew across at a 45-degree angle and cut off the excess. Sew the binding into place and it's finished. My issue with finishing like this is you have to get the ends just right, or you'll have too much or too little binding. So let me show you the easier way. The easy version. Cut off the excess, leaving 2 inches to turn under. Optional. Carefully use a lighter to lightly singe the edge of your binding you just cut to prevent fraying. The beginning of the binding, the part we didn't sew down, turn the edge under a couple of inches. Line up the binding so the folded edge wraps around the end of the binding, finishing it. Sew the remaining unsewn binding into place. Finish your seam and trim your threads. That's how you make the fleece blanket with the satin binding. If you're worried about somebody sticking stuff in there, if you're giving it to a little kid or something, just a little bit of a zigzag stitch along here to finish that off, or a couple of hand stitches will do that as well. And that is it. You have this great, it's just luxurious. It's this beautiful, luxurious blanket. I love the mix of textures. It just feels so good. And it is one of those classics for baby showers, but also, you know what? I bet you got an adult friend that wouldn't mind getting one of these as well. If you like this project, I have several more tutorials on my site, fleecefun.com, that I know you'll enjoy. I have a lot of blanket tutorials, fleece hats, mittens, things you can wear, all that good stuff. I even have stuff on this channel you should check out, all along those lines with free patterns and tutorials that come with videos just like this one. So let me know in the comments below, would you like to receive one of these as a gift? And while we're talking, do me a favor, hit that like button because, you know, it makes me feel good. I'm gonna be honest, it's true. And hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so you know when I post, so you don't miss out on another great tutorial. So have a great day. And remember, velvet is pretentious, fleece is fun. And it feels really good too. I mean, it's just cozy.